Thanks for the invite. So I'm the only thing between you and lunch, so I'm gonna try to be efficient here. Yeah, so this is a very cool work that I'm doing with my collaborator from Baylor, Sebastian Acosta, and some of my students. So Edward is my student, and we have had plenty of RU students also join us to work on this. And the topic of this project is this theory of optimal transport. Full disclaimer, I'm not trained in anything related to biomedical research, so I'm an applied mathematician. And then this is my first incursion into these waters. So if we have physicians in the room, sorry for the mistakes that I'm going to do there. But yeah, so the idea here, the plan for today is like twofold. So first I'm going to introduce this area of mathematics called optimal transport, which is where I was trained and where this collaboration started, where the idea is to sell you optimal transport as a cool set of techniques that you can use for biomedical signal processing, and then one set of results that we have done on the detections of jet tachycardia, which is one type of supraventricular tachycardia, and then sell two opportunities, one related to federation and decentralization of biomedical signal processing, and the other one related to personalization of models. So just like a quick introduction of optimal transport. So this goes all the way back to Napoleon, believe it or not. This was a mathematical theory that was initially described by Monge, which was one of the military engineers from Napoleon. And the task that they have once they build a structure before a battle was to even the terrain, because it's better to have battles on flat terrain. So the task for Monge was that given once you have built this structure, how can you even the terrain with the debris? So in a sense, was an optimal transport. This is how you move piles of debris into holes to make the terrain even. So that was the whole, and he was a mathematician, so of course, he did not solve the problem, but he proposed the theory of how to solve it. But the whole point of optimal transport is that it allows us to compute distances between objects that are not necessarily numbers. Right? We're trying to say, what's the difference between the number 1 and the number 2? Well, it's 1. But what if I ask you, you know, we always joke about comparing apples to oranges. What's the distance between an apple and an orange? Well, optimal transport enables a formalism to actually compute this distance. So the way we're going to define a distance between two objects using optimal transport is the effort necessary to transform one shape into the other. So given that you have a pile of debris, how much is the effort to transform that pile of debris into filling up the gaps into the battle terrain, right? And then you can imagine that depending on the type of data that you have, those are different piles of debris that you want to use to fill different other holes in the terrain. So they say that was the overall idea of this project, which is can we use optimal transport to analyze this type of data from biomedical signals that are not necessarily numbers, but more like signals that have certain shapes. But the whole concept is that it allows us to compute distances between objects that are not necessarily numbers, right? And some of the cool properties that, let's say, sold me on using optimal transport are things like the following. So I have here showing you two signals, the red and the blue one. They are exactly the same signal. It's just that one is shifted with respect to the other one a little bit, but exactly the same. And what I'm showing here in these two plots, so the left plot is the distance using traditional Euclidean methods between these two signals, the original one and the shifted a little bit. And the x-axis is how much I'm shifting one signal to respect to the other. So even though it is exactly the same signal, depending on the shift that you do, you will have this sort of like weird behavior of the distance, right? Even though it's exactly the same signal, it's just shifted a little bit. But if you do the same exercise using optimal transport distances, you got this picture on the right, which has this smooth convex behavior, which in a sense somehow captures the geometry of the signal better. So as you shift the signal a little bit with respect to itself, it has a convex behavior or a smooth behavior that we like to better analyze. And you can imagine that if you're recording like ECG data, like each of the heartbeats are not exactly one on top of the other, but you have some variation in between them. Right? And of course, optimal transport has taken machine learning applications. So there are applications to painting, to arts. There's applications to biomedical signals in the brain. There are applications to 3D imaging, applications to text, applications to shape, to painting. So let's say this is one of the, let's say, theories or let's say developments that have been used recently a lot in many applications. And of course, I'm an applied mathematician, so I cannot avoid having a theorem in the slides. But now that we're talking about interpretability, I think the best measure for interpretability is that if you can write a theorem about it, right? Like if you can write a theorem about your result, it's fully interpretable, right? Let's say, and right? The question is how hard is that? But like, and what I want to point out is that we have a rigorous theory about optimal transport. And we have results like this one. Like you can ignore most of the things, but what you can focus is n is the number of iterations that your algorithm requires. And epsilon here in the denominator is the error that you can tolerate. So if you give me the error that you can tolerate, I can give you exactly how many iterations the algorithm needs to run, right? So that's as interpretable as you can get, right? And this is a theorem, so it's true, right? It doesn't depend on the data. It is a true statement. And this is the type of true statements that we can make about optimal transport, right? And so how can we use optimal transport? So one of the classical problems is computing averages, right? We compute GPAs and type of things. So in order to compute an average of a set of numbers, you add them up, and you divide it by how many numbers you have. Right? That's the way you compute the mean of things, the average. And it turns out that you can write the average in a more complicated mathematical way as the solution to an optimization problem. And this optimization problem is nothing more but finding a point x that minimizes the average distance to all the points that you have, right? If you find a point, that's how it's in the middle between all your points, that's the average. Well, this optimization problem makes sense because you have these two bars here, which means distance, so Euclidean distance. But if your data points are not numbers, you cannot use distances between them. So what's the obvious thing? Well, if our data is not numbers, let's use optimal transport distances to do that, right? So instead of measuring distances Euclideanly, like here, let's replace this distance between point x and xi as some genetic distance. And what genetic distance we want to use? Well, this optimal transport distance. So in this sense, the average shape of a bunch of non-numbers is the solution of this optimization problem, where W is the optimal transport distance between the points. So again, this is a bunch of mathematics, but let's see how this works, right? What if I ask you what is the average shape of the number 7? Right? So in memory, we all know how to write the number 7. But then if you ask a computer to give me the average shape of a number 7, like if you're a computer vision scientist, you can imagine that all these number 7s as images are pixels, so you can do like pixel-wise averaging of these images. But of course, not all the number 7s have the same scale, the same rotation, the same position. So what's going to happen is that you're going to get something like the thing here in the top, right? One on top of the other. But if you solve exactly the same problem using optimal transport, you get this image here on the bottom. Again, it's one of the images that sold me on these type of things, actually capturing the geometric structure of the data, right? And of course, you can have all these other examples. For example, here you have two not concentric, like two ellipsoids. If you compute the optimal transport average of all these images, you get these nice two concentric circles, which makes sense, right? So we're preserving the geometric structure of the data. And here are some simulations of what happens on some data that you have. So even though you start with different numbers, as the algorithm runs, you get a very nice average of what each of these numbers from 0 to 9 look like. Or you can do like other type of data, like Gaussians, like everything that are non-numbers, you can do this type of averages, and it sort of works geometrically. So now, okay, how can you use this for this type of exploration of junctional ectopic tachycardia? So we have physicians in the room, so let's say the easiest explanation is something like, the heart has two parts, the top one and the bottom part. So when the two beats that we hear in the heartbeat is like the top one sending blood to the bottom part, and then the bottom one also sending the blood to the rest of the body. So jet is when these two things beat at the same time, right? Instead of top one and bottom one, both of them beat at the same time. And then this happens, or the type of data that we have are with children that have had open heart surgery. The problem with this is that this is very hard to identify, and this is identified visually. So you have doctors and nurses actually looking at the ECG, trying to see if you are missing some of the peaks in the wave. And so this is sort of like a picture of what it looks like. So you can see here, P wave is like the first top part of the heartbeat, and then the bottom part. And when that P wave is very small or missing, this is when this type of tachycardia is happening. And if you see like an ECG, this is going to look like something like here in the bottom, right? So you can imagine that around here in the middle is where the problem started to happen. So the question now is that this is a process that is done manually. So can we use optimal transport to somehow detect these type of variations in the shape? So this is a preliminary study that we did. So what you're seeing here in the y-axis is distance to sinus behavior, or what a normal heartbeat should look like. X-axis is the time, and this is only one patient. And then we're comparing both distances based on Euclidean measures and distance based on optimal transport. So what you can see for the red one is the Euclidean one. So what you can see here is a bunch of false alarms, right? These peaks here appearing, while the optimal transport is not causing these false alarms. But then at the end here, where the emergency actually happens, both of them behave actually the same, but with all these false alarms along the way. So let's say this was one initial indicator that it seems like this type of geometric features is allowing us to reduce a bunch of false alarms and having the same detectability somehow of this emergency. So this is only one patient. And then you can do things like clustering, but instead of clustering based on Euclidean distance, you can do clustering based on Wasserstein distance, and we get this type of results. Right? Again, the same patient, and we're trying to identify different behaviors. But the important thing is that you can recognize this yellow behavior as normal, and then here this purple one is when the tachycardia actually starts happening. So we can actually detect these events effectively. And maybe even the pre-tachycardia events, like this thing here in green, right? So this is again, showing that we can actually detect. You can imagine here the frequencies, like the likelihood of being in normal state, then here decreases, and then the likelihood of being in tachycardia state. What are the results that we obtain when we analyze the actual data? So you can see here we can detect these blue signals, which are normal or sinus behavior. We can detect the red signals here, which are missing the P wave. So these are jet or tachycardia behaviors. And then we also detect this green signal, which is errors in the segmentation of the data. So we were able to actually detect that there were errors in the data that was given to us, right? So in here, right, instead of having one single heartbeat, you have two of them here. So what we had to do is like, okay, go back. Now we have errors in the data. We need to go back and fix those errors in the data. Of course, so we were able to fix the segmentation errors. And like the way to do it again is using optimal transport instead of trying to detect when the shape of the signal is very different to what we should expect. So detect, like highlight this data out and fix it. So we actually do it, and without showing much details, what we can do with these theories, things like this. So blue one is the thing that is given to us, and orange one is how it should look like. And after our fixing, we can get these results like here on the left, right? Like we can actually clip the data when it should be clipped, instead of having these automatic segmentation errors like was given here in blue. And we can do all the things. Of course, for the keen eye, you might imagine that ECG signals are very noisy, have positive values, negative values, different shapes. So don't worry, optimal transport has methods to handle all this type of data itself. So in the case where you have positive and negative values, we can design methods that can handle both of these. So as you can see here, you have 2 data points or 2 bits. We can actually compute what is the middle or the average between these 2 heartbeats. And then just to finalize, another experiment that we were playing around with is now let's do mid-scale. So for this one, we have around like 50 million heartbeats to analyze. So that's a large-scale experiment. So here is just a middle scale, 250,000 heartbeats. So this is the results, let's say, big summary. When you use Euclidean or traditional linear methods, this is the confusion matrix, or let's say normal and tachycardia. But the important number here is 53, right? If you use like your basic linear classification method using Euclidean distances, you get a performance of 53%. And then if you do exactly the same, but with Wasserstein distance, with optimal transport distances, we get like around 10% improvement on the performance, where we take into account the geometry of the signal, right? So now quickly 2 interesting things, opportunities for federation. So one of the things is that, so these results that I show you were actually run in a federated environment. So you can imagine that instead of having one single hospital, you have a network of them, and each of the hospitals only have few samples of the number 7, and you still want to compute the average of all of them without having to share the data because of privacy reasons. So can you develop algorithms? Well, in fact, like these images that I show you here were actually run in a fully decentralized environment of simulating 100 hospitals over a network that are not sharing any private data, but still are able to agree what should be the average of these number 7. So in our case, what should be the average shape of a normal sinus behavior versus a jet tachycardia behavior. And of course, again, opportunities for personalization. So what I want to mention here is all this training or these models are usually done in a synchronous manner. So let's say you can imagine all these hospitals agreeing upon something, and then once they receive all these models, something is aggregated, and then they continue. But in reality, they work in an asynchronous manner, right? So maybe you get one model, you update another model, you update another model, you update. Well, we also have work or have some theory about how to work this in an asynchronous federated learning model. And of course, personalization. If we have 2 patients, the red and blue, you want to find a good spot such that you can train models that can personalize to individual patients, because we know like each individual patient might have different characteristics. So again, we have studied how to do genetic initial models that can be quickly personalized to individual patients as well. So just to finalize, we have some challenges for the future. Efficient implementations, not everything is nice. This requires huge, enormous computational capacities. This is not quick. This requires a lot of time, a lot of supercomputing power. We need to understand better how to represent biomedical signals into the theory of optimal transport, how to segment it, how to fuse them, how to build robust classifiers from them, and also run very large-scale studies. As I mentioned, we have around like 50 million heartbeats that we can play around with this collaboration with Baylor. And yeah, that's it that I have for today. Thanks.
Any questions for Dr. Uribe?
How does this distance metric compare to using Euclidean distance in terms of computational complexity? Mm-hmm. If I want to have like a particular problem, and I saw that you got better performance using that distance metric, like what is the cost more or less?
So in Euclidean metrics, let's say you're comparing 2 numbers, the computational cost is a subtraction, right? You subtract the 2 numbers and then you compute the absolute value. That's the distance. In optimal transport, you need to solve a convex optimization problem. That's the computational cost, yes.
Gotcha, thank you.
Thanks for the explanation. for optimal transport, I'm trying to understand it from a machine learning point of view. So if you use OT as your distance metric, what is sort of the inductive bias you're putting on the model? Right, so what's your prior, if you will, that you're imposing? Can you describe kind of what is the prior that you're imposing when you use OT distance versus L2 distance?
But what do you mean inductive bias here? Because I'm not doing generalization studies, right? So this is let's say
you're
training
trying
error.
you're trying to do anomaly detection, right? So there's some, normally you think of it as some sort of, I'm trying to learn a joint distribution of what's normal, and then I have some statistical distance measure. Oh, this is abnormal now, right?
Right.
Some likelihood with respect to the normal distribution, or with respect to the sinus distribution in your case. Is there a way to think of OT in that way?
So we are using this based on labeled data that was labeled by physicians, right? So the data that we have are labeled as what is normal and what is JET. So we're just aggregating those labels into one representative sample of what is normal and what is JET, right? But maybe
let me rephrase the question. So you have two distributions, sinus and JET, and you could treat them as Gaussians and then just find the mean of each, but that would give you the L2 norm mean, and that's very blurry.
No, but that's the thing. Like you cannot just compute like what is the distance between two distributions, right? It's like the mean itself is a distribution, so you cannot use Euclidean distance there.
Okay, I'll ask you offline. Maybe I'm not.
Hi, okay. I have one comment and one question. So firstly, I think JET never happens as an independent cycle. So I think the actual proper modeling is to predict the continuous interval in an online manner. And a question about is that, so the transform-based actually takes the geometry of the entire cycle, but the point of interest is only in the P wave. A lot of variations exist in other waves. Right. So you actually mix the geometry of interest with some other variations that are not interesting enough. Because of course, different patients have very different morphology, especially for pediatric patients. So how do you deal with it? I think that's a very huge issue.
You're totally right. You're totally right. So the way we're handling this is we're using asymmetric cost of moving, let's say, mass from one point to the other. So if the cost of moving mass around where the P wave should have is higher than moving in some other parts of the P wave of the waveform. So let's say we can tune down where you want to focus the distance, so you can let's say minimize the impacts of other things outside the P wave. But and the first part is you're totally right. So we're looking at individual heartbeats, but in general we should look at trends, not one individual. Like classifying one heartbeat doesn't make much sense, but more like trends of like frequency of this detection, maybe.
Okay, that will conclude our morning sessions. Thank you, Dr. Uribe.
Yeah.
And